Hello, this is Paul Lucas for Jumpstart Nature Photography. In this session, we're going to start discussing the craft of photography, and we'll talk about the exposure triangle and the first part of that, which is shutter speed. As I'd like to remind you, you can see my work at paullucasphotography.com, and if you're interested in having me speak at your local library or photography club, or teach a class or workshop, or want a copy of this presentation, please email me at paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. Also, I'd like to offer up to you to send me your photographs to critique online on YouTube. Send me 4 photographs or 4 or 5 photographs, whatever we might want to do. And here's the details of what we'll do in that critique session. But it's a positive and constructive critique of your work. It's the same kinds of things I do with my students in class. And this is really an opportunity to grow and learn and understand how to make better photographs, both when you're taking the photograph, compositional ideas to think about, and what you do once you have the photograph. And if you're interested, email me, paul@jumpstartnaturephotography.com. So this course is about really 3 big goals: the craft of photography, helping you understand how to use your camera; composition, how do we create and compose great pictures; and creative use of life. And right now we're covering topics around the craft of photography. And these are all ideas to get you started. There is not one right way to do any of these kinds of things like composition or how to use your camera. So this is one method or one idea, one process of getting you started. And hopefully it'll ground you well enough that you can then go on and look at how other photographers process their work, create photographs, etc. And you can adopt and adapt, some of the techniques I've shared with you and some from other photographers. So in the craft part, we're going to cover these things: the exposure triangle, and the subtopics under those are shutter speeds, ISO, aperture, and then we'll talk about how aperture affects the depth of field and reciprocals. And we're going to get into each of those in this presentation. We're covering shutter speeds. In future presentations, we'll cover those things in depth. And then we'll also talk about cameras and lens and some miscellaneous topics. This is not going to be an all-comprehensive. These presentations are not going to cover every aspect and every detail of photography, but enough to get you started in creating great photographs in your backyard. So here we are, the craft of photography, and we'll talk about shutter speed. So just to remind you, there's really kind of 2 larger aspects of photography: the craft, how using the camera, the lens, the exposure, choosing all these things that we can. How does that affect your artistic vision, the aesthetic? And that is the art part of the photograph. The composition, what we do in the field to create that composition with the things we learn about the craft, and also we'll talk about some things about what we do after we get that photograph captured and we're back home looking at our computer. So the exposure triangle, there's three pieces to it that make up what we call a correct or a good exposure. Well, maybe not correct is the best word, but a good exposure. So the 3 things are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And we're going to cover individually each of these in different presentations. Today, we're going to be covering shutter speed. And what is this exposure thing? Why do we need to understand that? So the correct combination of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO will give us the correct or a good exposure. And if we want, for artistic reasons, to change one part of that, maybe we want to change our aperture or our shutter speed, how does that affect the exposure? What do we have to do? Those 3 things have to work in concert. And those 3 things you may need to adjust. If you adjust one thing, say the shutter speed, it will affect the other 2. Do we need to make a change to one or both of the other aspects of the exposure triangle to get the correct or a good exposure? I'll try and use the word good exposure. And for ease of learning this, when we make changes, we call to stop. And for this set of discussion topics, the exposure triangle, I'd like to talk in whole stops. I think it's important to commit to memory eventually, maybe not in the very beginning, but it will help you to understand the exposure triangle, to think about when you're out in the field how the exposure affects your artistic vision that you're trying to capture. But I find it easier personally to think in whole stops. That's the way old cameras used to work. Modern cameras can adjust the exposure triangle, any of one of those 3 corners or angles, shutter speed, ISO, or aperture in 1/3 and 1/2 stops. Now, I like to think in whole stops. It's just easier for me to process. What would I suggest? I would leave your camera set up to do 1/3 stops, because eventually we're going to talk about some techniques to adjust things, and 1/3 stops, adjusting things by 1/3 of a stop on your camera, it is good. I mean, the main thing is to understand moving, do I move over? Do I need to add exposure? Do I need to lessen exposure? And how does that affect other parts, like the shutter speed, for example? So in my mind, I think of whole stops. I leave my camera set at 1/3 stops. In the beginning, I'd suggest maybe when you make adjustments, think in whole stops. So when you add a stop of light, one more stop, you are doubling the amount of light from the original exposure. And we'll talk about what that original exposure is. Or if you add one less stop of light, you're halving the amount of light falling on your sensor or your film. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we'll talk about the dynamic range and how this is related to exposure. So the dynamic range of a photograph is from the very brightest things to the very darkest things. Bright things might be sparkly reflections or a very white surface or object. Dark things are deep shadows or dark shadows or black colored objects. And so the human eye, we can see about 24 stops. It's a pretty huge range from very bright to very dark. You can be out on a bright sunny day with the sun, coming almost right, not quite into your eyes, but close to it, and you have a very bright blue sky, and you're looking on the side of a building, and it's or in the woods, and it's very dark shadow. A camera cannot see that entire dynamic range. Maybe if there's 20 stops of light, a camera sees a subset. Our human eyes are really powerful in many different ways. One of them is in the amount of from the brightest to the darkest range of light within our picture. Cameras, depending, if it's a point and shoot, it may have 5 stops. Film may have 5 or 6 or 7 stops. Newer digital cameras have 12 or more stops. Some of the latest ones coming out now have 14 stops. And sometimes we refer to the range, the stops, the way they change the different aspects of light and dark as tonal or tonalities, or the tonal range in the picture. You'll hear that used also within that. So just as an idea, kind of to see what does that mean from bright to dark, here's an example of 12 different stops. Cameras are designed, when they look at a scene, to meter in what they call 18% or medium tone. Grass is medium tone. Caucasian skin is 1 stop over what we would call 18% gray. So many, many years ago, when film was developed, the physicists, chemists, and scientists that worked on that determined that 18% gray, we would call that the middle tone. And then you can see the range from very bright, 5 stops above, to 5 stops below, just to give you a sense from brightness to darkness in a 12-stop example of how the tonality changes. In black and white, it's very easy to see. In color, it's a little more challenging. So what is a correct exposure? So here's an example of a photograph metered with the camera, set in matrix metering. We'll talk about that in a moment, with a correct exposure. How do we know it's a correct exposure? So the camera, I set up the aperture, as I mentioned in my first field session, or you'll hear again, aperture setting for depth of field or depth of focus is typically the most important thing within our landscape or nature photograph. So I set this at f16, and I fixed my ISO speed. This one was at 400, and it came up with a particular shutter speed, 1/60th of a second. And that's what it said was a correct exposure. How can I double check in a digital camera if I have a correct or good exposure? I'm sorry, I keep using the word correct, a good exposure. We'll talk about this in an upcoming presentation, but there's this thing called a histogram, and you can turn that on in your preview section of your camera when you're reviewing your photograph to give you your histogram. And there's an overall histogram. In this picture, you see the gray. That's the overall histogram. And then your pixels on your sensor, there's 3 channels, red, green, and blue. And that's why you see different colors. They show the actual colors and the effect of the exposure on those particular pixels. Now, where do you want a good exposure to be? Generally speaking, you want it right. All the data to fall in the middle not too far to the left or not too far to the right. We'll show an example in a second there. That gives you a good exposure. That means that you're not losing any information or data in the very dark parts of the picture. If it's nothing on the left side, that represents the dark parts. The brightest or lightest parts are represented on the right-hand side. If you don't see, if there's no data that goes off on the right-hand side, then you've not lost data in the brightest parts of your scene. So like bright parts are the part of the stone path walkway, some of the railing, the white lantern-like object in the foreground, some of the sky reflection. Those are very light elements. And then the darker shadows under the bridge, the shade, those are darker tones. So ideally think of this as a goalpost, and you want your exposure in your histogram to land in between the goalposts, just like you're kicking a field goal. The amount of data, like you can see, there's more dark data, but it's within the left hand of the field goal. So I'm not losing data on the dark side of the photograph. It just happens to be there's more dark data captured in this photograph, neither good nor bad. So if you have something that's underexposed, you can see all the data is pushed up against the left side of the histogram. And you can see we're starting to lose detail in the shadows. There's information that we have lost. And conversely, if you're 2 stops overexposed as an example, you can see it's very bright and we've lost some detail in some of the brighter areas, some of the detail in the bridge and the little bit of the stone in the pathway at the bottom middle part of it. We've lost some data. So the idea, I'm going to flip back, is to get an exposure where the histogram, you would land in the goalpost, right? If it's too far to the left, we lose data. If it's too far to the right, we lose data. I'll just make one comment to put it into your mind. There's a thing called exposed to the right. Typically, if we metered this photograph and that was our data, I might look at that and say, can I move it a third or a half stop or a whole stop overexposed? The reason for that is the data, the way the camera captures the data is logarithmic, meaning that we don't capture the same amount of digital data on the left side as we do on the right. So if we can move our exposure a bit to the right without overexposing, losing data. So in this example, we've lost data because we've pushed data. You can see the data is pushed off the right side. If we can move it to the right a little bit, maybe we could have gotten 1 stop overexposed. We're actually capturing more data that we can process later. Initially out of the camera, your picture might look too bright, and you'll make some adjustments to enable the vision, your artistic vision that you want in Lightroom, but we've captured the most data that sensor can get. So we'll cover that again in the histograms when we talk about histograms in a future session. So again, how do we set our metering on our cameras? For Nikon users, you set it to matrix. For Canon, you set evaluative metering. And for Sony, it's called multi. And I apologize if you have a different brand, an Olympus or something, please send me an email and I'm happy to look in the owner's manual and tell you what the metering that's like matrix or evaluative or multi in. Matrix metering. I'm sorry I don't have a graphic here because all the graphics in owner's manuals are copyrighted, so I can't put it up here. But basically what matrix metering is the camera has a special metering sensor, we'll call it, that looks at the frame of your picture and captures as much data, 80, 90, maybe almost all of the data of light coming in that would hit your sensor. So the matrix, evaluative, or multi covers the most amount of the sensor in gathering light and evaluating what that exposure is. And then each vendor has created a database based on tens of thousands of example shots as to how you should set your camera, how the camera should be set to get the proper exposure. So remember, just one last thing we'll mention is we're going to set our f-stop, f11 or f16. We'll set our ISO, our sensitivity at its lowest, and then we'll see what the shutter speed is in our photograph. And then we'll adjust the shutter speed accordingly, depending on the aesthetic we want in that photograph. If we want it really sharp, we may have to increase the ISO, increase the sensitivity, so that we can bump up the shutter speed and let more light in, or less light, and freeze that shot. The faster the shutter speed, we freeze that shot and we get a sharper image. So let's talk about shutter speed a little bit. So shutter speed, we think of it in seconds or fractions of seconds. The faster the shutter speed, meaning the less light that's coming in, like 1/30th of a second freezes action, and the slower the shutter speed, a half second or 1 second, blurs that action. So shutter speed is how long the camera shutter is open, how long the light hits the sensor or film. And it can range, cameras will range from as fast as an 8,000th of a second, just a real high fraction that that light is exposed to, a very long time, seconds, it could be minutes. You can actually set, you have to time it. Most cameras go to 30 seconds with the settings that are built in, but you can also hold the shutter open manually, so to speak, and get longer exposures as several minutes. So it can range from very fast to very slow. So again, the higher the shutter speed, that's based in a fraction, so we call that higher shutter speed, so to speak. 1/60th, 1/25th, 2/50th, 500th, 1,000th, those are going faster, meaning there's less time that the shutter's open. Freezes elements in your picture versus a lower shutter speed. So we start at 1/60th, lower shutter speeds, 1/30th of a second, it's open for a 30th, 15th, a half, a whole second, 2 seconds. We're leaving the shutter open, letting more light fall on that sensor for a longer period of time. That blurs elements in your picture. So as an example, here's a small waterfall at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and I set it up, shot it at f11. It was in the shade, and to get a faster shutter speed, 1/400th of a second, I had to bump up my ISO. And this will all start making sense, right? These are the three elements of the exposure triangle. So I set my camera at aperture priority just so they keep hearing this, and I adjusted my ISO from 100th of ISO 100 up to 6400, so my shutter speed would be 1/400th of a second. And as you can see, you actually can see, the splash of the water is frozen, you can see it, all the different parts. If you look at the leaves in the foreground and up around there, they're frozen. There's a little bit of a breeze that day, and you can see they're very sharp. So faster shutter speeds will help with our photograph's sharpness. Now aesthetically, you may like this picture, you may not. It may or may not be interesting, but it's important to understand what you're photographing and how the elements of the exposure triangle changes the vision or aesthetic or art, what you're trying to get across. So if I go with a really slow shutter speed, so you can see to really slow it down on that day, I dropped my ISO to 100 and I bumped up my my aperture to f16, and I was able to get 2.5 seconds. And by doing that, I get that really silky effect. Now, aesthetically or vision-wise, I prefer, going back and forth a bit, the silkiness, that blur of the water. I think that's a really beautiful effect and makes a photograph much more dynamic and interesting. If you notice in the foreground, try and do this a little more slowly, the leaves are not as in focus. I mean, the breeze was moving the leaves around, so the shadows changed a bit, but you can see that the leaves are not quite as sharp as they are. If my vision was to illustrate the silkiness of the water as it's falling, then I would sacrifice some of the sharpness of the leaves. The rock sharpness is not going to change, obviously, because the rocks are not moving. So this is the effect of shutter speed in the exposure triangle. So all the charts for the exposure triangle on the left side are how we do settings for less light. So that means that's shorter time that light's being exposed or less light is falling on the sensor versus shutter speeds where there's more light. So that's why sometimes the numbering may not always make sense. The common thing is on the left side we'll have whatever the exposure triangle calls for to get less light falling on the sensor of the film, or more light on the right-hand side. So the faster, as we say, shutter speed, and those are in fractions of a second, faster means it's open for less time. So as you can see, we go to smaller and smaller fractions, larger and larger numbers, but smaller and smaller fractions, going left, less light. More light going to the right means the shutter is open longer. So as it says in our example, if the shutter speed calls for 1/30th of a second. If we want to have more light falling on the sensor, we're open a longer period of time, we go to the right here, we go to 1/15th of a second, and we're doubling the amount of light that reaches this sensor. And that is increasing the exposure by 1 stop. So as we move to the right, those are each 1 stops. We're increasing the amount of light as we go to the right, the longer the shutter is open. If our correct exposure or good exposure is 1/30th of a second, and it's a little breezy, maybe we want to, set the shutter speed to really make those leaves sharp. Maybe we're shooting a scene with no water. It's all plants and trees, etc. Or we have a runner, right? A human being, if we start doing those kinds of photographs, we'll even need faster shutter speeds. But to get a faster shutter speed to freeze elements in our photograph, elements in our composition, we would go to less light, 1/60th of a second. And there we are having the amount of light reaching the sensor. And the reason it's good to understand this is changing those things are going to affect the other aspects of the exposure triangle. If we increase the shutter speed to 1/60th of a second, maybe we have to change the aperture, the opening of the lens. And we'll talk about what aperture is in an upcoming presentation. Okay, so this is the exposure triangle covering shutter speed. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. Again, it's Paul at Jumpstart Nature Photography, and I'll see you next time for the next part of the exposure triangle. Thanks.